The San Joaquin Valley, California's largest agricultural region and a vital contributor to the U.S. food supply, embodies the state's most difficult water management problems, including groundwater overdraft and contaminated drinking water. A new report from the Public Policy Institute of California explores the key challenges and promising solutions. The lead author of that report is our guest, Ellen Hanak, the director of the Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center.
Additional funding for the Maddy report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California channel at the state capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Everyone has an opinion on water, but what are the facts? Our guest is Ellen Hanak, the Director of Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center. She certainly knows those answers to those questions, and she's actually the lead author of a recent report that takes a comprehensive look at the Valley's water challenges, particularly the issue of groundwater overdraft and water quality. Here's a copy of the report, and we encourage people to take a look at it if they got the opportunity. But let's start off by asking you some basic questions about the San Joaquin Valley, things like population and growth and GDP, all those kinds of issues. What can you tell us about the San Joaquin Valley?
So this is a very fast-growing region, 4 million people, expected to grow by another 1.4 million between now and 2040.
That's a lot of growth.
That's a lot of growth. It's one of the fastest-growing regions in the state, and it is also the state's largest agricultural region. Over half of all of the agricultural output, measured in dollars, is produced here in the valley. It's a very diverse set of crops and livestock products.
The land use in the valley, I would assume then, is going to be for farmland?
So if you look on the valley floor, about 8 million acres, maybe 9 million acres, and 5 million of that, about a little bit more than that, is irrigated cropland.
Wow.
Another 3 million is unirrigated rangelands, open space. Cities take up about 500,000 acres.
So about 1/10 of the irrigated farmland area. Okay. So what about groundwater? We're going to talk about that a little bit. Can you give us some statistics on groundwater and this whole issue of overdrafting? What's that about?
So people in the valley use two kinds of water. They use water that comes in through rivers, surface water, and they use water that's pumped out of the ground, groundwater. If you look at sources of surface water in the valley, that includes water from the local watersheds, from the eastern, from the mountains in the east, especially the Sierra. Yes, it's stored in dams, but it comes from the rivers, San Joaquin, the various tributaries to the San Joaquin, the Kings, the Cahuilla, the Kern, all up and down the east side. And then that water also goes down into the ground and provides groundwater. We also get water here in this region from the Delta, gets pulled in from Northern California and is used here. That combined imports and local supplies makes up about a little bit less than 90% of total net water use, and the rest is extra groundwater that people pump.
Yeah, and you're talking about in your report about overdrafting. Specifically, what is that?
So overdraft is when you're pumping more groundwater than it's getting replenished. And groundwater does get naturally replenished when it rains, and also water comes in from the mountainous areas into the ground. It gets replenished. It can also be replenished intentionally when folks apply water to certain places that are good for recharging. If you're only using as much as you're replenishing, your groundwater levels will stay stable.
It doesn't happen in droughts, though.
It doesn't happen in droughts, and unfortunately in the valley, it doesn't even happen in normal years. The only years where there's really net replenishment in this region are really wet years.
And so when you have this overdrafting, bad things happen.
Bad things happen. So one is just your wells go dry, you have to dig deeper wells. The deeper you have to pump, the more energy costs you have, so it gets more expensive to pump it. It also is causing land to sink in the valley.
Called subsidence.
Subsidence, and when that's just happening on farmland, it's not maybe such a big deal as if it's happening in a city. But if it starts happening around roads and around canals.
Canals, and then what I've read also is the canals then are less efficient in the movement of water, so now they're not.
Big time. So there's this big canal on the east side of the valley that really connects a lot of the agricultural areas called the Bryant Kern Canal. That has lost over 60% of its capacity.
Wow.
Because of this subsidence or land sinking.
Yeah. So given all these surrounding problems with overdrafting, the state enacted this thing called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act Sigma?
Sigma, we call it, for short.
Sigma. It's
Friends call it Sigma. You know.
Okay. In the fall of 2014. So what's it supposed to do generally, and what's it supposed to do in the Valley in particular?
So it is all about requiring local water users in groundwater basins around the state to organize themselves, create groundwater sustainability agencies, develop groundwater sustainability plans, and start implementing those and get to sustainability by the early 2040s. The Valley is ground zero for this. The Valley has the largest overdraft as a region of the whole state, close to 2 million acre feet a year. So about 11% of total net water use is overdraft. And that's on average, year after year. This is like a 30-year average looking at that, so counting for wet years and dry years. And the Valley's ground zero also in terms of experiencing things like the dry wells, the subsidence, and just concerns with losing that drought reserve, because you're always going to, when you have groundwater, you want to have some of it there for droughts because you don't have the river flows during the dry years, and you need some water.
And it's called groundwater banking, so we're going to talk about that. All right, we're going to talk about the balance of supply and demand of water in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Groundwater pumping, particularly during droughts, has led to a groundwater deficit. To close that deficit, groundwater sustainability agencies, or GSAs, will have to both increase the supply of water and reduce the demand for water. There are lots of options, some good, some not so good. What are the most promising approaches? We're going to find out because Ellen Hanak is the director of the Public Policy Institute's Water Policy Center. She knows the answer to these questions. So let's talk about how do we get more water? This is kind of the supply of water. What are the options?
So there are a lot of things that folks are looking at, and we examined the range of different studies that are out there and tried to look both at how much water physically might be available from these options, and then the key question is, what would it cost and how much of it is affordable? And especially we looked at this from the perspective of what's affordable for farmers who have to make a profit after buying their water.
So one of the things you talked about was capturing more runoff.
So, right, and that turns out to be really the big option that looks the most promising from both a supply volume and an affordability perspective.
And that's recharging groundwater, but that's also, isn't that dams as well?
That could be. The basic category is what extra water is available in this watershed from the Sierras that is not currently already captured and used or required by somebody downstream. Right. And when we think of somebody downstream, that either means water right holders that have a claim to the water downstream or the environment. And so, there are downstream claims on water, say, flowing out of the San Joaquin River, for example, but there are times when there's extra water. And this is a good example this year. There are going to be times, it's a wet year, when there's going to be plenty of extra water beyond what everybody needs.
But one of the things I noticed in your report where you're talking about how much farmers are willing to pay for water, $300 to $500 an acre foot is a lot of money, probably not willing to pay that. But dams like Temperance Flat, for example, you could store more water, but it's kind of more
so then
costly.
You think about, okay, you have to, if you're going to capture this water, you got to store it because our growing season is in the summer. So any year you need water to be stored in order to use it in irrigation. And so the question is, what combination of storage systems are you going to use? Right now, we actually have 3 kinds of storage. We have snowpack that holds the water on a temporary basis. It melts it kind of conveniently when the irrigation season is getting underway. Then you've got surface reservoirs. And then you've got actually a lot of water stored underground.
Right.
So the question is, where do you augment relative, and what's the most cost-effective way to augment? What we find is that there's a lot of potential to augment without a lot of expense by storing more underground.
And the answer's right underneath your feet.
Underneath your feet. But that's not to minimize the role of the surface reservoirs. They play an important role in kind of holding the water temporarily so that you can get more of it into the ground.
Well, let me ask you this. The other side of the equation is reducing the demand for water. What are some of the options?
The options there, the main option is agriculture reducing water use. And I say that not not picking on ag or anything, it's just because ag is within the valley, the major water user. So that's where, it's kind of like Willie Horton and Why Did He Rob Banks?
Right,
that's where the money is, that's where the water
But you also make an interesting point about expanding water trading. Could you briefly talk about that?
And that is the idea that, ag is going to have to be the main water use reducer. But if farmers are forced to do that in a very inflexible way, just sort of across the board, everybody has the same proportional cuts and every crop gets cut the same way, it's going to be very costly for the valley economy. What you want to do is encourage flexibility so that farmers can move the water to the fields and the crops that are most profitable and productive. What we find is that you can reduce the costs by almost half by encouraging trading within local groundwater basins.
A market-based solution.
Market-based solution.
Yeah. So when you talk about an optimal portfolio, when you're balancing water supplies and demands, what would that look like?
Optimal portfolio is combination of the most cost-effective supplies. So that's going to be especially groundwater recharge, but there'll be some other things to do too. We think you can get to about a quarter of the deficit with those cost-effective supplies. And then the other piece of it is flexible demand management. And that means allowing water trading within these local basins, but also some trading across basins.
Yeah, you also talked here, I'm looking at your report, talking about incentivizing recharge on farmlands. What's that about?
That is one of the cheap ways to recharge groundwater. I mean, we think about recharging groundwater. You see some places, like here in Fresno, there's Leaky Acres area. Right now it's full of water. These are recharge ponds. That's a good way to, if you've got a good area that really recharges fast. But farmland, a lot of it is very suitable for recharge, and just getting water, you can spread it out pretty quickly on a lot of farmland. You can get a lot of water in the ground in wet years.
One of the things you mentioned about doing that is you need to have a system, kind of an accounting system that's going to make this work, right?
Right.
So you know how much water you're putting in, so how much water you can take out.
Exactly.
And more sophisticated.
And this is already being done in some parts of the valley now, down in Kern County especially, where they've been doing these formal banking projects with outside partners. So they've got to, if somebody's going to invest in that, you got to show them the books, right? And with this new groundwater law, that is forcing folks to think about their groundwater accounts everywhere in the valley. And that's going to create the conditions that make it possible to incentivize these kinds of new investments.
Okay, well, another big issue we're going to talk about is groundwater contamination and water quality. Like air quality issues, water quality issues require multi-agency cooperation. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Addressing the valley's water quality issues is not going to be easy or fast. New groundwater regulations are adopted over the past decade is going to require numerous local and regional entities to cooperate and work together to fix this problem. Are they up to the task? We're talking with Ellen Hanak, the director of the Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center, about those issues and others. So let's talk about water quality. How bad is the problem and what's causing it?
Well, there are a lot of different groundwater quality challenges in this valley. From a drinking water perspective, the valley is really a hot spot for the state's safe drinking water crisis.
A lot of these smaller communities are really suffering.
A lot of smaller communities, and they face problems both of some human-caused contaminants like nitrate, which is from agriculture mainly, but also some industrial contaminants, but also some naturally occurring ones like arsenic.
Yeah, and so you're talking about the sources of water quality are nitrates and salts. Naturally occurring, but the nitrates, they're kind of like a legacy problem, right? That's been...
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
I mean, the nitrate that's in your well today is probably from agriculture that was farming from 30 years ago.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that there's not an ongoing problem. There continues to be nitrate contributions of nitrogen to the soils and the groundwater from agriculture. Basically, that's a fact of farming.
Yeah, fertilizing.
If you're using nitrogen fertilizers, which people have to use on pretty much on most crops,
Right.
that's going to lead to some of it.
You go to Home Depot or something and you're buying stuff for potted plants, it's got nitrogen in that soil.
Right. Actually, in terms of managing the nitrogen, farmers are much better at it than we are, than homeowners are.
Okay.
Yeah.
And salts are the other issue.
Salts are the other issue, and that is partly naturally occurring here in the valley, but also it's imported partly through fertilizers, but also partly through water coming in from the delta.
And that makes, if you have too much salts, I would assume that it's not farmable. You can't use it.
Right. Whereas the nitrate is a problem for drinking water and drinking water safety, the salts are really mainly a problem for ag productivity because what happens is it reduces yield potential over time, and it hits the most valuable crops first. So, it means that farmers lose money when they've got a lot of salinity in their water.
Yeah, and so we were talking earlier about groundwater recharge is a really good way to improve the supply of water. But how do you manage that and water quality?
So this is going to be one of the tricky challenges now as folks really move to increase groundwater recharge, is that they have to do that in ways that are mindful of the fact that some of these soils have legacy pollutants in the surface areas, but also if it's active cropland, farmers are applying nitrogen. So how to do that, how to kind of balance those things, and you're seeing very interesting experimentation happening now. I was talking to an almond grower who was saying that some folks are now experimenting with not putting the fall fertilizer application on, because if it happens to be a wet year like this one, then there's less risk of pushing that nitrogen down into the ground and better chance for recharging the groundwater.
You've also talked something about clean crops.
Clean crops, yes. Now we're not going to have everybody in the valley switch to clean crops just to be able to recharge groundwater, but there are some crops that either don't require nitrogen, like alfalfa, that actually fixes nitrogen, or turns out wine grapes and grapes or vineyards in general use very little nitrogen. So those are crops where you can more safely apply that water, and they can tolerate the recharge too. So if you've got that combination with good recharge soils, that's a good bet.
More grapes, okay. But
that's right.
You're talking about also in your report about actions that you're recommending that should take priority to ensure both water quality and quantity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So we also say that in addition to focusing on improving the recharge and doing this well, that managing for long-term overdraft and reducing that, people are talking about a glide path. And what that means is sort of gradually reducing overdraft over time rather than what I call cold turkey sustainability. And that runs the risk of causing safe drinking water problems in terms of wells going dry. So if the local groundwater users want to do a sort of gradual path to sustainability, they have to worry about those communities that might lose their water supplies.
One thing you mentioned in here too is something about dairies and managing the manure problem, frankly.
Yeah.
So what about that? How does that address the problem?
The dairy industry faces the biggest challenges in terms of managing continued nitrogen loading because they just have a lot of manure. They're very productive, but one byproduct of that is a lot of manure. So they have to get better at managing that on their farms. They apply that manure to their corn silage especially. But also, we're recognizing now that there's just too much of it for them to use. So finding technological solutions that can convert that manure to products that can be used on other farms. So, precision kinds of fertilizer that are made from manure.
It's all part of the equation, I guess.
Yep.
Well, up next, we're going to talk about the transition of land and water use as a way to kind of make it beneficial for both farmers and the environment. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Ellen Hanak, the director of the Water Policy Center at the Public Policy Institute of California. Is there a way to transition land uses that both benefits the environment and the property owner? So for example, what are some of the potential uses of permanently retiring or temporary fallowing current ag land?
Okay, so this is going to be a big issue for the Valley to face, which is we expect at least 500,000 acres are going to come out of production in order to help bring groundwater basins into balance. And that's good for the long-term economy of the Valley.
So that's about, is that about 10%?
It's about 10% of irrigated cropland. Yeah. And it's not going to happen overnight. It'll happen over time. And we're suggesting, people have to really think about this carefully, because if you don't plan it and it's just sort of done piece by piece, parcel by parcel, you're going to end up with not much to show for it, and potentially actually additional dust problems, additional weed and pest problems for neighboring farmland, and so on. So the alternative is to plan ahead, look at how you can stack benefits, kind of get this idea of multiple benefits where which lands can be used for restoring soil health and getting credits for carbon storage, because that's a big interest both of the federal government and the state government right now. Where can you...
Solar would seem to be a big issue.
Where can you put solar in strategically? That can probably go on about maybe 10% of these lands. You can do that in ways that can also get you habitat benefits. So again, something that can bring in some other revenues. There are opportunities in some places to have recharge areas that are also serve as intermittent wetlands. Very good examples of this down in Kern County already that are, have become these great places for birds during wet years. I'm sure there are a lot of birds down there right now. And you can also think about on river corridors, getting more floodplain habitat, which is great from an environmental perspective, recreation, but also saves water. And so thinking about all of these things together, you can actually mobilize a lot of different kinds of funding for this, and you can also build broad coalitions of support but you can't do it unless you plan it. And that's,
Right.
our message is, now's the time to think about that. It's not going to happen overnight, but unless you plan it, it's going to not happen in the way folks are going to want it to
When they
happen.
talk about groundwater sustainability, they're talking about phasing this thing in over a period of years and not expecting it to happen overnight.
Right.
So it takes a while. So what action should take priority?
First priority now is getting some planning going at the level not only of the local groundwater agencies, but at the level of counties, and ideally also, we're saying, really at the level of the region for some of these things.
It's just like, the water issues are like air quality issues, right? It's not going to stop at a county line.
Yeah, and ideally, you want to think about strategically, if you're thinking about wildlife corridors, for example, they don't stop at a county line either, right? So thinking about how folks can incentivize that, kind of like the way, the Valley has been trying to think about planning something like, Highway 99 and kind of where to make investments. That's a backbone. You can think about some of these things as backbones too, because you're going to want to do it while you're thinking about where you're putting new water infrastructure, where you're making, recharge investments, where you might want to manage lands for salt. And that's a conversation that really you want to bring thought leaders and partners from around the Valley to that table.
So there needs to be more regulative flexibility too, right?
Yep. The planning is just getting started is planning, but in order to do anything, you need flexibility on the regulatory side. There's some good regulatory approaches to help with this, but they're not easy and fast and quick enough. And you need to also be able to scale them up to make it so that not each landowner is going to have to go through that morass.
Right, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
The other thing you mentioned in your report was providing incentives and funding.
Right. So we looked at the range of different funding sources, and there actually are more than you would think that sources that could be used for this. And I think there'll be some new sources as the groundwater agencies start to develop their plans. Some of them are going to be setting aside, charging fees for extra pumping, so that farmers have the flexibility to do that, but then you can use that money for this purpose too. There are a lot of different buckets of money, but right now they're not being directed in a coordinated way.
That's a great way to end up. I want to thank our guest, Ellen Hanak, with the Water Policy Center at the Public Policy Institute of California. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.